Okay, testing 1, 2, 3. We had some technical difficulties, so we're getting started a little late. Okay, hi, my name is Sean Canning. I'm the principal architect at 1070 Architecture, and this is the initial live stream. So this is a little bit of a test, and please excuse some technical difficulties we've been having. Also, if you hear some construction noise in the background, that's one of our projects being built next door. So please excuse that. Today, I want to go over some general items, and I'm going to try to share my screen to explain these. First, I want to go over some big changes that occurred in San Diego over the last couple weeks in terms of zoning and what that's going to mean for your future development projects. Second thing is I want to do some general notes about my business, 1070 Architecture. Then I want to go through some permitting struggles, and I want to explain to you what we've been experiencing when we submit projects for permitting in the city of San Diego. And then finally, I want to wrap up with a couple questions you guys submitted and try to explain to you the answers of those questions. And hopefully, you'll find that valuable. Okay, so let's get started with some of these big changes to zoning in San Diego. So, the most significant change we've had in a long time happened 2 weeks ago, and this was approved by City Council. And that essentially is the transition from the TPA overlay zone to the SDA overlay zone. So a lot of acronyms here. I'm going to try to break it all down for you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay. So this is a local news article talking about the new SDA zone, and this is a sustainable development area. And anytime the zoning changes in San Diego, there's always some sort of large debate, basically the not in my backyard crowd versus the yes in my backyard crowd. But what does this mean? Well, let me explain it using this this map, which is provided us by the city of San Diego. So as of last month, we had this overlay zone called the TPA, Transit Priority Area. And what these orange outlines do here, what they're showing is the outline of the TPA zone. The TPA zone, by definition, is 1/2 mile as the crow flies from any major transit stop. A single bus stop does not qualify. You'd have to have at least 2 bus stops on 2 different lines at the same block for it to be considered a major transit stop. Now, the purpose here, what they're trying to do with this TPA zone is to allow more dense development around areas that have mass transit. And those two things have to work together. We have to allow for more density and larger developments, and we have to be building up. But we can only really make this happen if we have mass transit installed. And as I'm sure you've expected, the two parties who are controlling these things don't always talk to each other, and they're actually complete two separate entities in entirety. Mass transit is very hard to install, especially after a city's been developed as far as San Diego has. So the city's starting to approach the low-hanging fruit, which is bicycle lanes. Now that doesn't qualify for the TPA zone, but it's a step in the right direction. But we need more transit, more mass transit, to really make these higher density zones work. Now, the criticism of the TPA zone has been that it does not account for any of the canyons. So topography is completely ignored by this overlay zone. So if, for example, your house is over here on the south side of Route 8 and the mass transit is on the north side of Route 8, you can't reasonably get there. Not with a bike, not by walking. It would be almost impossible. So what the city has done is they're going to now have this new overlay zone called the Sustainable Development Area, the SDA zone. And if I turn on this overlay zone, you're going to see that all of this green area is now part of the SDA, which will replace the previous TPA zone. So what the city has done is they've figured out that they've incorporated the topography into this overlay zone. And the measurement is now taken 1 mile from major transit stops, but no longer as the crow flies, but as people walk. So you can see how it's now been removed from a lot of the canyon areas around here. And there are some areas which were previously included in the TPA zone, like let's say this area here on the east side of Murray Canyon. But now it's no longer in the SDA zone. Now that would be really disappointing if you owned a property and were trying to develop that property, because you're going to be more limited. But there's much more areas that were not included in the TPA zone that are now included in the SDA zone. Here it is. So if you are in this SDA zone, you're supposed to be benefiting by two major things. The first is you can develop an infinite amount of ADUs up to the maximum height of the base zone and up to the maximum FAR of the base zone. So you'll still be able to develop the same size structure, but now you'll be able to develop it into more units. I know there are groups like Neighbors for a Better San Diego, which have an alternate take on this. But I've looked through their documents, and I shouldn't say most, but a lot of the information they're presenting to the public serves their own interests and is not actually correct. So what I'm trying to do here is present a very unbiased take on this. Okay, so the SDA zone here is going to allow you the ADU bonuses, but it's also going to allow you to use the Complete Communities program. And these are the benefits of the Complete Communities program. We're supposed to get an expedited permitting, which I can guarantee you will not happen. You're supposed to have an FAR-based height, which allows you to go higher than the base zone height, an FAR-based density, which allows you to have more units than the base zone generally would. You have to provide affordable housing, and they're also going to scale the development impact fees for you. And these are the areas that are currently part of the Complete Community Zone. And we're expecting when the SDA zone is fully implemented it's already been approved, but it hasn't been moved into the code. We're expecting these complete community areas to reflect closer to the SDA zone. Now, with the Complete Communities program, you can build much taller than the base zone. So I can understand why people who are really opposed to density would have a difficult time understanding the Complete Communities program that San Diego has. But the important thing to understand is that San Diego is a growing city. We need to add more density, and we need to add density in the appropriate areas. So that's kind of the key here. And the appropriate areas are now determined by this SDA zone. So if you now have a property in the SDA zone, the development opportunities are much more open for you. So that's the first news. Big changes in San Diego. I think my personal opinion here is this will be very beneficial, provided we keep up with mass transit. That's kind of the key here. Okay, so let's move on to the second part here. I want to talk about some things that we've been working on in our business. So we do have some new projects, and you can now see these new projects on our website. We've added a section to the website, which is in progress. And we're working on an ADU here on 42nd Street. We have another ADU here on Ticonderoga. This is a project in the county, so not city, but it's a nice large home. And this is an ADU here that is in the city of San Diego. So we've been working on mostly custom homes and custom ADUs, and almost exclusively we work in the modern and minimalist style. Let's take a quick look at some of this work here. So this is an ADU we've developed. It's a custom ADU. It has a U-shaped plan with 2 exterior seating areas. The roof slopes towards the interior, which is a little unique. It's a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom unit, and I believe this is just about 800 square feet. And here are some of our design development renderings. This project is currently in engineering, and then it'll be moving into permitting. Let's take a look at one more of these. This is a custom ADU for a client. It's built on a sloped lot, has a swimming pool and a jacuzzi, and it has a large door system which opens up to the deck and those amenities. Here's a preliminary look at the kitchen design. And this is another one that's in engineering right now, and we're working on the construction drawings so we could make a submittal to the city here. The other type of projects we've been starting to work on is much larger multifamily projects. We have completed a couple R2 occupancy projects. R2s are triplexes or greater, but this is the largest one we've been working on right now. And the challenge of this project is it is on a pretty small lot and it's on a slope. So we've been working with those two conditions, and these are basically the drawings that we've created and the renderings we've created. We're right about to move out of the design development phase here and move into engineering on this project. Just a couple minor things we have to dial in before we do that. Generally, through our process, we show the client renderings of the project so they can understand how things will probably look, because most of our clients don't spend as much time as we do looking at architectural drawings. And lastly, I do want to mention that we do have a pre-designed ADU, which we are marketing. You can go to the website, 1070architecture.com, and follow these links over here to find more information about this. This has been called the Prince House ADU. It's been featured on San Diego Architectural Foundation's Open House San Diego tour. It is a 1-bedroom, 1-bathroom unit. It's designed to be as cost-effective as the construction prices in San Diego allow. It does have a reverse floor plan, so the living room and kitchen are up on the second floor, and the bedroom and bathroom are on the lower floor. It has a very small footprint, so the actual footprint of this project is 21 feet by 13.5 feet, and we are now working on our third version of this. So this is probably our best option if you're looking for a lower cost custom ADU design. Second floor has vaulted ceilings, which make it feel much larger than the actual footprint. So feel free to shoot me an email if you want more information about this pre-designed ADU. Okay, let's move into the next thing. And I'm going to try not to rant about this one, but I want to talk about permitting, and I want to have a real conversation about permitting that talks about real timelines and the real stress that occurs through that process for us and for our clients. So first off, this is right from San Diego's Development Services Department website, and these are their listed timeframes. And you'll notice that they actually have 3 parts to this. There's an intake, a review, and a permit issuance. So let me just first explain what each of those are, and then we'll go through and talk about how long these things are actually taking. So the first phase of permitting is intake, and this is basically when we upload the project and when they receive the project and then find out where to push the project, which departments need to see these projects. And you can see your standard building permit right here is going to take about 24 days once they receive the project to when the appropriate departments are assigned that project. Then you go into a review period, which we're going to come back to in a second. But this is basically when the departments who are required to look at your project all get your plans and then begin their plan check. And the review period includes a few cycles. So every time the plan checker in each of these departments does their plan check, they issue a series of comments, and then those get sent back to us. And then we revise our drawings, respond to the comments, and then resubmit. And that's one cycle. And oftentimes projects will have 2 cycles. It's fairly rare to have a single cycle. So generally it's 2 cycles, and sometimes it can be 3 cycles because certain departments are harder to satisfy. And I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more in depth in a bit. But finally, once you've satisfied all those departments, you go into permitting issuance, and here they're listed. A building permit would take 25 business days, not 25 actual days. So that's about a month to issue that permit. Okay, so let's talk about this one and these timelines specifically. So let's see, first review average days. So we can see that electrical is now at 102 business days for their review, and engineering is at 112 business days for their review. Now we have about 20 business days per month. So based on this, you're probably looking at around 5 months for these reviews. Once you were to re-upload that, once you were able to respond to those comments, then this is their recheck time. So that could be another 3 months here. Stormwater is looking at 4 months here. So all this is doing is creating an extended time frame for permitting, which is very frustrating. Now, they are not allowed to take this much time to do their reviews. In fact, when we submit, we know when their reviews are due, and they always miss these dates. In fact, I know the structural department has been missing those dates since I started this business 13 years ago, and it's never been corrected. Now, let me show you something real quick. This is the state of California's bill, which addresses ADUs, AB 68 land use accessory dwelling units. And if I just do a quick search here, you're going to see this bill requires a local agency or to ministerially approve or deny permit applications for the creation of ADUs or JADUs within 60 days from the date the local agency receives a completed application. Now, there's some other criteria for this, but in our experience, we have never completed a permit in 60 days for an ADU project. So there's a huge conflict between what the state is requiring and what the city is actually doing. And that's the first thing I really want to point out. And while I know a lot of people in politics in San Diego are very pro-housing, we're incurring this giant bottleneck at the permitting cycle. And that's been very, very frustrating. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is a preliminary review service. This is a service which is recommended by the building department. And what I'm looking at here is one of their info bulletins. It's number 513. They have quite a lot of info bulletins. It would be nice if they could put all of this into the municipal code where we can find it all in one place. But basically, these are supposed to provide some additional guidance that is not part of the code. And ultimately, it just makes for a much more confusing process. But let me explain to you what this is. So in this sentence here, they kind of break it down. But basically, the municipal code can be pretty vague, and it's hard to get consensus when you ask questions to the DSD. So to provide that consensus before you move forward into the more expensive parts of a project, like engineering, particularly on these larger projects where you have multiple engineers that are all going to have their fees, the architect needs to understand exactly how they are allowed to design a project. Now, while I believe that the public has an inherent right to understand a clear municipal code, unfortunately, that's not provided by the city of San Diego. So we fall back on this preliminary review service here. This is a paid service where we get to submit diagrams, floor plans, elevations, and we get to list questions, and then they will go on record answering those questions, and you can use that answer for 1 year out from the time you get the preliminary review back. Now, there's different options. There's a single disciplinary review if you just have questions for one department, or there's a multidisciplinary review if you have questions for multiple departments. And most projects will probably require about 2 departments. Generally, planning and structural are the most critical, but oftentimes on smaller projects, you may just do this for a historic. So those are all important departments to have clarification on before you move into the more expensive parts of the project. Now, according to this, and I should share the fees here. So if you submit a multidisciplinary review, it's almost a $6,800 cost. So this is not a cheap cost. Now, about I was speaking to a colleague yesterday, and he let me know about 10 to 15 years ago, this cost used to be around $770. So it's gone up by $6,000 over the last decade or so. And of course, there's other fees that apply here. Now, a single disciplinary review is much less expensive. So if you only have two disciplines, like planning and structural, you may want to consider doing two single disciplinary reviews. Now, here's the problem with this service here. Just going to find this real quick. Okay, so this is what the info bulletin, which is the information we get to explain the service. This is what the info bulletin says. Approximately 15 working days after the submittal date is the time frame. Now, what we've been experiencing is over 4 months. So what that means is when we get a project from a client, that client is usually paying holding costs every month to let that project sit there while we come up with a design and go through engineering. Like I mentioned, we have to resolve questions we have before we go into engineering. So while this document states 15 working days and we pay $6,800 for this service, the city is taking over 4 months to respond to our comments. So if your client is paying $10,000 a month, they've just spent $40,000 while waiting for the city to be extremely late on a project. Now, the other issues we're having with these preliminary reviews is that the information, while it's supposed to be able to be used to develop an entire project, a lot of times, and I would say more times than not, the information we receive is incorrect. And that's a major issue. We have actually submitted preliminary reviews at the same time with the same questions for different projects. And when we receive the information, the preliminary reviews differ with their answers. So this is very frustrating. What we do when that happens is we send this back to them and we have them revise it. In fact, we always have at least one question, which is a little bit complicated, but a question that we know the answer to in our submittals to just make sure that the person providing the answers knows what they're talking about. So if you've ever dealt with the building department, you know that it's impossible to get a straight answer from them. Now, this is a service that the building department offers, which can be helpful, but at the same time, it can also be very misleading. So you can Google book a virtual or in-person appointment, and you can come to this website right here. This is a development services website, so it's right from their website. And you can actually go down here and book a virtual appointment with different departments. We've been using this service for the last 3 years or 2 years since they implemented this. Now, the problem with this service is we ask the same questions to different staff and we get different answers all the time. So, for example, last week we booked 2 meetings with the planning department, and these meetings are 15 minutes each, so you don't get a lot of time to go into detail. I asked the same questions that were on my preliminary review, that multidisciplinary review I mentioned earlier, and the person in this planning department gave me the exact opposite answers. So I had to reach out to the deputy director, and he gave me his own answers, which of course conflicted with the other 2 people. All of these people are in the planning department. Nobody has a consistent answer. And the questions we're asking are, if an ADU can be in the setback, can I use a post to support that ADU in the setback? Or can a balcony go into a setback that is allowed for an ADU? So we're seeing wildly different answers. And the only reason this would occur is because there's a lack of understanding of the municipal code, but also because there seems to be a general lack of management where the manager should be teaching their employees, their staff who's answering these questions for us, how they want the municipal code to be interpreted. And it should be a black and white interpretation. There should be no gray area in the municipal code. One more issue that we're having with these multidisciplinary reviews, sometimes the city is not answering the questions that we're paying for. So we asked a question about ADUs in a front yard setback, and they said they cannot answer that question. But ADUs could be allowed in front yard setbacks with certain constraints. So when I submitted a project like that, it would go to the planning department. They would have to answer the question at that point. So we don't get the full service we pay for when we submit these preliminary reviews. So I'm not quite sure what to do about this. The code is vague. They recommend we submit this preliminary review. It costs our clients a lot of money, and then we get incorrect information when we submit it. It's a broken part of the permit process in San Diego, unfortunately. Okay, the last thing I want to mention before I move away from permitting is if you are permitting a project in the city of San Diego, review your invoices. We're seeing an 80% inaccuracy rate of invoices. And in all situations, they are overcharging, sometimes by thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So check your invoices when you get them from the DSD. You're dealing with a department that is notoriously undertrained. You need to check your invoices. Okay, so now I want to move into a couple questions that came up. Some people submitted some questions on Instagram. You can check our Instagram feed out at 1070 Architecture. That's 1070 Architecture. So first question, it's actually an ADU question, and this is very confusing, so I'm glad somebody asked this. What are the setback requirements for ADUs? Okay, so the setback requirements from ADUs are completely independent from the setback requirements that are set by the base zone. So if you're building a single family home, you're going to have different setbacks than if you're building an ADU on that same lot. So an ADU, this applies to JADUs as well, which is 1 story or less than 16 feet in height, can have a 0-foot setback for the side and rear yard, but not the front yard. The front yard has the same setback that the base zone has. So comparing a single family home versus an ADU, they're going to have the same front yard setbacks, but the ADUs and JADUs have a 4-foot a 0 side and rear setback. But now once the ADUs get above 16 feet or become multi-story, now they're going to have a 4-foot side and rear setback, but still the same front yard setback. If you have a corner lot, there's also a street yard setback, and the ADUs, JADUs, and a single family home would all have the same street side yard setback. That only applies to corner lots. Okay, there are cases where a base zone is allowed a reduced setback. This happens in multifamily zoned lots where you have a narrow lot. I believe it's lots that are 25 feet wide or less in certain RM zones. You can have a reduced setback down to 3 feet. Now, here's the catch. The ADU or JADU is not allowed to have the 3-foot setback. Even though the single family home can now have a 3-foot setback per the base zone, the ADU and the JADU still requires the 4-foot side and rear setback. Now, I'm not sure why this is the case. And let me explain a little bit. 1 year ago, all ADUs and JADUs were able to have a 0-foot setback. So this wasn't part of the code 1 year ago. But like I mentioned, the dwelling units had to respect the base zone setback. So at that time, the intent of the code was to allow an ADU or JADU to have a reduced setback as little as 0 feet from the side yard and rear yard setback. Now, all of a sudden, they're requiring a 4-foot setback. But for some strange reason, if the base zone allows a setback less than 4 feet, the ADUs and the JADUs are not allowed to have that setback. I don't know why this is. It doesn't seem to make any logical sense that a single family home or multifamily home for that matter could have a 3-foot setback, but now an ADU has to be further back when previously it could be closer to the property line. So I don't know why that happens. It's a strange interpretation in my opinion. And we did have one project that kind of got caught up in that mix, and we were able to get a special exemption, luckily, because we would have had to redesign the entire project otherwise. So just be careful for this one. If you have a reduced base zone setback, it does not apply to your ADUs or JADUs. Okay, so I did mention earlier, the state has a new code, which is not, you cannot find this in the municipal code. The state is saying that you can build an ADU in the front yard setback. You won't find that anywhere in the city of San Diego's municipal code. Um, Now, if it's not in the municipal code, that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means we don't know how to do it. So the city cannot override the state's regulations. And the state is saying we can do this. The question is, how do we do this and when can we do this? And that's what we don't know. So if I was to speculate about how it would actually work, I believe the only case when you can build an ADU in the front yard setback would be if there's no other place on the site where you can fit an ADU, and if this is your first ADU on the site. That's the way I imagine the city will interpret this. We actually reached out to them in a preliminary review question, which we paid for, and they deferred to answer the question. They did not answer that question. So we sent it back to them and we're saying, you need to answer this question. It's a paid service. This is what we paid for. So it cost a few $1,000s to get that answer, and I'm going to get that answer and I'm going to share it with everybody. Okay, here's the one last catch about ADUs. This is something we clarified this week through a preliminary review process, and I want to share this with the public to make sure everybody understands this. If you are going to design an ADU within the space between the actual base zone and the ADU setback, so for example, if you have a 15-foot rear yard setback from the base zone and a 4-foot rear yard setback for your ADU, you could build the ADU in that space between that 4 feet and that 15 feet. But there are certain things that are not allowed in that space. You cannot have an exterior staircase. For some reason, that is considered not part of an ADU. So the workaround is you would have to enclose that staircase as part of the interior of the ADU. Once you do that, that staircase becomes part of the floor area ratio of that ADU. So you got to watch out for that. But there is a simple workaround. The second thing is you cannot support an ADU with a structure that is in that area between that 4-foot and 15-foot base zone setback. So what that means, if you wanted to build an ADU up on stilts to have a carport or a patio space below, you can do that provided the stilts, the posts that would support this ADU, are not in that space that is part of the base zone setback. So no posts, no walls, no structural support under an ADU if the ADU is in the base zone setback. Now, there could be a workaround here. It's probably that you design an interior staircase and use the walls of that staircase as part of the support for the ADU. But there's no workaround if the design just had posts. So be careful about that one. And that is not in the municipal code anywhere. It doesn't say you can or you can't. It's completely vague. And the next one is balconies. So even though an ADU is allowed in that setback, a balcony, an exterior balcony, is not allowed in that setback. I'm not quite sure why they're making this determination. One of the people we spoke to said that the purpose of allowing ADUs in the setback was so that more people could build ADUs, but I suppose they don't want people to have who live in ADUs to have balconies. So I don't know. In my opinion, it's a strange interpretation, but that's what they're telling us. So that's the information we use to create our designs. Okay, so that was a great question. The next question here is, why do we focus on residential architecture exclusively? So probably about 98% of the projects we do are residential projects. And at this point, about 15 years of my architecture experience are residential designs. I prefer doing residential designs because we like to spend more time in the design phase. And when you have a commercial project, the client wants them to move very fast. So you don't really get that opportunity. And of course, a commercial project needs to open faster so the business can make more money. So I understand why those ones have to move a lot faster, but we prefer to spend a lot of time and really craft the design. And I also feel very strongly that designing residential units are almost more personal than designing commercial spaces. when you design a home for somebody, they're actually going to live in that home. And there's a lot more care that tends to go into those projects. And that's something I really appreciate about residential architecture. Okay, so the last question we have is why do we only do modern and minimalist architecture? So, to answer this question, I would say that when I was in architecture school, when I started architecture school, I didn't understand what modern architecture was. The term gets thrown around a lot. It's generally a term that's used for big white square or rectilinear buildings, structures that have more of a horizontality than vertical. And those terms get mixed around quite a bit: modern, minimalist, contemporary, all of those types of things. So let me just define those terms. So I would say contemporary is anything that's being built of the day. So those big traditional homes that are being put in by developers, I would say those are contemporary homes because they're being built today or in this time, in this general time frame. Modernism is not a style that creates an aesthetic, but a series of principles that create an aesthetic. And that's why you can get modern homes that look drastically different from one another. So modernism is form follows function, which means the building is going to look a certain way because of how the building functions. And it's the rejection of unnecessary ornament. So if it doesn't have a purpose, then get rid of it. And that was kind of like the anti-Victorian movement, which there were certain styles that were just going over the top with the ornamentation. And modernist architects said, hey, we're not going to be doing this anymore. So modernism is not a new thing. It basically coincided with the Industrial Revolution, but it actually goes back way earlier than that. And in fact, recently I attended a wedding at a early modernist, I guess it was an early modernist home in Northern California, and I believe it was built around 1915 or 1920. Typically, we think of modernism starting in Germany around 1920 or in the 1920s, but evidently the principles were being used around the United States, at least in California, earlier than that. So I'm not sure if there were kind of two independent schools of thought that kind of converged, or if somehow these architects were talking to each other. But if you're interested in early modernist architecture, you can check out William Worcester's work, who was a name that did not come across our desk when we were studying the history of architecture, but he was actually doing early modern architecture in California. So right here, I'm on the Villa Savoye Wikipedia page, and this is what the building looks like. This is designed by Le Corbusier, whose name roughly translates to the sparrow, which is kind of a cool nickname. And while this is not particularly an attractive building, and I'll admit that, it has principles which were then pushed forward in the aesthetic of modern architecture, or in the theory of modern architecture. So these are the 5 most critical ones. So the first thing is he supported the building above ground with what he's calling pilotis. I believe that's a translation for like pillars, or what we would call today by posts. And you can see that in the design here. So he's doing this to create space for a car around the bottom. It could also be used for a patio. And like I mentioned earlier, if this was an ADU, these would not be allowed to be in that setback. So just be careful about that. This is not an ADU though. So the other principles, he has a functioning roof, which serves as a garden. So he's now made a purpose for the roof besides just shedding the elements and precipitation. He has a free floor plan devoid of load-bearing walls. So this is a really important one. Let me see if there's a floor plan here somewhere. There's no floor plan, but if I come here, I can show you a floor plan. So in his design, he has these posts on the interior of the structure. And what those posts do is they serve to support the home. And because the posts are doing all the work to support the home, the plan can do whatever it wants because it's independent of structure. So this is going to allow him to create an open floor plan. Maybe you can say that this was the innovation that led to the open floor plan, which became more popular in the 50s. And today it's what 99% of our clients are asking for. Of course, an open floor plan is when you combine your public spaces like your living room, dining room, and kitchen into one general space. Okay, so let's go back to his 5 points here. So the free floor plan is something that was really critical here. The long horizontal windows, and he's saying for illumination and ventilation, but I think the point for these long horizontal windows is that these structures came about at the advent of steel in construction. So once you can use a steel beam to support all of these, and maybe you don't need a steel beam here because of the pillars, but generally in modern architecture, where you see these long linear ribbon windows, there's a steel beam across the top. And we couldn't do that until we had access to steel, which occurred in the 1920s during the Industrial Revolution. So modern architecture generally is going to use steel or wood, and it's no longer going to use an arch. So you tend to get more horizontal looking buildings. Okay, and there's one final point here. And where did it go? Freely designed facades functioning merely as skin for the walls and windows, unconstrained by load-bearing considerations. So this is basically what I talked about earlier. He has these posts in here. So those are supporting, here's a beam right here. Those are supporting the structure, which means there's no load coming down on the exterior walls. So those are free to do whatever you need, which opens up our ability to do some pretty interesting things. So the reason, to answer this question, the reason I prefer modern architecture is because I agree with these principles. I think there's two basic aesthetic reasons why we create architecture, and that is the proportion needs to be correct, and I believe there's some sort of reminiscent value. For example, if you lived in a home with a gable roof, you probably like homes with gable roofs if you had a good childhood in that home. So I think there's two things that make a home look good, but beyond that, a functional home is almost the most critical. And you can do modern architecture with a pitched roof. You can do modern architecture with a flat roof. Modern architecture can look totally different. One home, a home in New Jersey is going to look totally different than a home in San Diego because of different constraints, particularly weather and temperature. But good modern architecture needs to respond to those things, and good modern residential architecture needs to be a function of the way a family or the people who are going to live in that home are going to live. So form follows function, and in terms of residential modernism, the function is the user of the home. So maybe an example of this is if you had a homeowner who was a musician, you could design a home to be more acoustically sound, and potentially the shape of the home could be a reflection of the acoustics of the home. So that would be a good example of how to do that. And just to put a pin in this question, the reason my wife Margaret and I prefer minimalist architecture, minimalism is a subset of modernism. It just is the extreme reduction of ornament. And minimalist architecture should not be confused with low-cost modernism. It's actually more expensive because you need to have a higher craft. But I would describe minimalism as kind of the empty inbox of architectural styles. Everything is put away, everything has a place, and there's not a lot of knickknacks around. So that is my preference for architecture. But aside from minimalism, modernism is a much more broad style or principle for architecture, which is what we practice at 1070 Architecture. Okay, so let me see if I can end the screen share here. Okay, so thank you everybody for watching this live stream. I apologize for the technical difficulties in the beginning. I'm going to try to do probably about one of these a month to just keep everybody updated with the changes in the code, the updates on permitting, and the types of projects we're working on. Anytime we get answers from the building department, I'm going to try to share them here so you have a way to understand how to design your own projects. And if you'd like to hire us, feel free to reach out to me directly. You can send an email to me at Sean, Sean, at 1070architecture.com. Reach out to us on Instagram, 1070architecture, or comment in this YouTube on this YouTube video. And if you like this video, like and subscribe so you can see the next one. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a good day.